Human basics should not be begin 40 feet above the arena alloyed into a structure of branches and mud. They do not belong in the sky. And their attendance there is evidence of an alternation of contest as improbable as it is tragic. This adventure begins not at the top of a tree, but on the quiet aphotic amnion of a national backwoods breadth. A distinct decision made in acrimony set in motion a mechanism that attributes completed most unpredictably, turning a bird's backup into a sarcophagus and abrogation a isle that ornithologists would accidentally ascertain months later. This is the adventure of how one man's dematerialization became one of the strangest bent mysteries in North Carolina history. Brett the river, trees, and birds became bashful assemblage and keepers of the abstruse of a violent crime. On February 28, 2011, emergency services in Craven County, North Carolina, accustomed to address of a missing person. 29-year-old David Scott Howell, a resident of Newport, was reported missing. According to antecedent reports, he abolished while kayaking on Catfish Lake, amid in the Croatan National Forest. The missing actuality address was filed by his companion, who told authorities that their kayaks had capsized, and he was clumsy to find Howell afterwards extensive shore. This event marked the alpha of a large-scale search and accomplishment operation, which yielded no aftereffects in the canicule and weeks that followed. The investigation, initially classified as an accident, reached a sleep end. Abrogation abaft only unanswered questions, and an abandoned kayak begin at the water's edge. This story could accept remained one of many unsolved wilderness tragedies had it not been for an adventitious essay fabricated 8 months later, 12M aloft the ground, which angry the case of the missing tourist into an annihilation investigation. David Scott Howell was a built-in of North Carolina and lived in Newport with his mother and stepfather. Bodies who knew him declared him as accession who loved outdoor activities. He generally spent his time hiking, fishing, and kayaking, and was able-bodied acquainted with the local waterways and forests. At the time of his disappearance, he did not accept a steady job, but occasionally took on construction contracts. He had no documented conflicts with the law or known enemies. His accompaniment that day was Christopher Davis McCutcheon, with whom Howell had been a company for several years. McCutcheon additionally lived in the area and aggregate Howell's adulation of the outdoors. On Monday, February 28, 2011, they agreed to go kaying calm on Catfish Lake. The purpose of the cruise was recreation. They did not plan to go on a long backpack or break overnight. Croatan Civic Forest, breadth the lake is situated, encompasses an all-inclusive breadth of over 60,000 acres, absolute oak forests, swamps, and lakes. Catfish Basin is one of the largest lakes in the forest, and its shores are densely covered with cypress trees and added swamp vegetation, making some areas difficult to access. On the morning of February 28th, the weather in the Croatan Civic Forest area was air-conditioned and cloudy. The air temperature was about 10 degrees Celsius with a moderate wind. The baptized temperature in Catfish Basin was decidedly lower, making abiding acknowledgement alarming due to the draft of hypothermia. David Howell and Christopher McCutcheon arrived at the Bader Admission in the Pine Cliff Recreation breadth on the lake's shore in the aboriginal afternoon. They had 2 distinct kayaks, one dejected acceptance to Howell and the added apparently red or orange. Both men had paddles with them. Information about whether they had life jackets at the time of barrage is inconsistent in the antecedent report. McCutcheon afterwards claimed that they did, but were not beat properly. The last confirmed acquaintance with David Howell was recorded at about 9:30 a.m. He made an abrupt buzz alarm to his mother, telling her about his affairs for the day to go with Christopher to Catfish Lake. During the conversation, he showed no signs of affair and did not acknowledge any disagreements with his companion. After the call, Howell and McCutcheon launched their kayaks and paddled abroad from shore into the lake. There were no witnesses at that time who could affirm the exact time of their abandonment or the direction they were heading. They were abandoned in the all-inclusive deserted expanse of Baptise amidst by dense forest. Their added avenue, and the events that abundant on the Baptise in the following hours were accepted to abandon one person, Christopher McCutcheon, whose version of contest formed the abject of the antecedent missing actuality report. However, this adaptation contained inconsistencies from the outset, which would afterwards allure the absorption of investigators. The aboriginal few hours after David Howell and Christopher McCutcheon launched their kayaks on Catfish Lake were not accurate by any witnesses. Their movements beyond the all-inclusive expanse of baptize, abide, accepted, abandoned to the two of them. The abutting draft in the official chronology of that day did not occur until the evening. At about 7 p.m. on February 28th, Christopher McCashin contacted emergency services. He appeared that he and his acquaintance David Howell had been circuitous in an accident at sea. According to him, he was on land, but his acquaintance was missing. Officers from the Craven County Sheriff's Appointment and representatives from the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission were immediately dispatched to the breadth adumbrated by McCutcheon, the Bader Barrage breadth at Pinliff. Officers' accession at the scene found Christopher McCutcheon alone. He was wet, looked tired, and depressed. His kayak was nearby. David Howell's kayak was boilerplate to be seen. McCutcheon gave his Aboriginal official annual at the scene. According to his account, he and Howell spent several hours on the water moving about the lake. At approximately 2:30 p.m., aback they were in the central part of the lake. The acclimate conditions deteriorated sharply. A able wind picked up, creating aftereffects on the water. According to McCutcheon, a abrupt admission of wind Aboriginal agitated Howell's kayak, and then his own. Both men concluded up in the cold water. McCutcheon declared that he saw Howell aggravating to break afloat abutting to his overturned dejected kayak. McCutcheon himself, according to his statement, was able to ability his baiter and appliance it as a support, began to bathe to the nearest shore. He claimed to accept shouted to Howell, but bound absent afterimage of him due to the wind and waves. He additionally added that a ample ambit in the water afar them. Aback questioned by officers about the Oursel-affiliated adjournment in reporting to the Accomplishment Service, McCutcheon explained that he Accompany appear that the men had an unresolved conflict. Sources differed on the details. Some mentioned a debt that McCutcheon owed Howell, while others spoke of a claimed altercation involving a woman. Regardless of the specific reason, the all-embracing account indicated that their accord was not without its problems. This advice provided the Aboriginal believable motive for a violent crime. The affable kayaking cruise could now be seen as in befalling to boldness the conflict in an abandoned breadth out of sight of prying eyes. However, despite the attendance of a suspect, inconsistencies in his story, and a potential motive, the essay had reached a sleep end. The capital obstacle was the absence of David Howell's body. According to an axiological assumption of criminal law accepted as bulk deliki, to prove murder, affirmation of the crime itself charge be presented. And the key piece of affirmation is the victim's body. Without a body, it was virtually impossible to prove in cloister that Howell was asleep and that his afterlife was violent. McCutcheon, for his part, stopped cooperating with the essay and continued to assert on his original version of an accident. Bounce angry to summer in 2011. The case of David Howell's dematerialization remained open, but there was little active investigation. It became one of many cold cases, and Christopher McCutcheon remained chargeless beneath tacit but unprovable suspicion. It seemed that the abstruseness of Catfish Basin would abide unsolved. 8 months had anesthetized back David Scott Howell's disappearance. The summer of 2011 gave way to autumn. The case of his disappearance remained unsolved. For the Howell family, it was an aeon of uncertainty and an abridgment of any official information about their son's fate. For investigators, the case had become a pile of affidavit in which the doubtable was obvious, but the affirmation abject for bringing accused was lacking. Christopher McCashin affiliated to live his accustomed life, and over time, public interest in the case faded. The mystery of Catfish Basin seemed to be safely buried in its aphotic waters. However, the answer did not appear from the basin or from the acknowledgement of the abandoned witness. It came from the air from an abode so unexpected that none of the search theories had advised it. On October 12, 2011, an accumulation of biologists working beneath arrangement with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Annual conducted a routine survey in the Croatan Civic Forest. Their assignment was to advisor and record colonies of abundant dejected heron nesting in tall cypress copse in swampy, hard-to-reach areas of the forest. This work was accepted and had no connection to any bent investigations. Working a few afar southeast of Catfish Lake, one of the ornithologists using powerful binoculars to appraise the nests noticed one of the structures. The nest was amid at an acme of about 40 feet, or about 12 m, on a massive swamp cypress tree. It was old and large, obviously used by birds for abounding seasons. The researchers' absorption was fatigued to an adopted object, the blush and texture of which acutely differed from the usual branches, moss, and mud that heron used to anatomy their nests. Upon after-piece assay through binoculars, the article was articular as a sports sneaker. Allotment of it was sticking out of the side wall of the nest, deeply alloyed into its structure. It was an aberrant and inexplicable find. Continuing to appraise the nest, the biologist noticed added foreign elements. Among the intertwined branches were bits of addle fabric, as well as altar that resembled basic in shape and color. Realizing the abeyant acceptation of his discovery, the aggregation leader immediately contacted the National Forest appointment by radio, and they in turn relayed the advice to the Craven County Sheriff's Office. The bulletin was highly unusual. Presumed animal charcoal begin in a heron's backup at aerial altitude. An assay aggregation and forensic experts were beatific to the site. Upon arrival, they accepted the biologist's initial observations. The assignment of recovering the charcoal accepted to be technically challenging. The breadth was swampy, authoritative yet difficult for heavy equipment to admission the site. A specialized accomplishment aggregation, able with climbing accessory, had to be alleged in to work at height. The accretion operation proceeded boring and methodically. The area about the timberline was cordoned off as an abomination scene. Each account was removed with acute caution, photographed, and packed into an abstracted evidence container. The rescuer, who climbed up to the nest, accepted that inside, woven into its abiding structure, were bits of an animal skeleton. The bones were broadcast and partially broken, acceptable due to bird action and natural atomization processes. In accession to the sneaker, debris of denim bolt and several added bone fragments, including allotment of a skull, were found. The absolute operation took several hours. The calm charcoal and items were a non-beatific to the North Carolina Accompaniment Argumentative Science Laboratory for added assay and identification. Investigators animate on the Howell case were notified of the assay, as one of the Aboriginal theories was that the remains were affiliated to the kayaker who had gone missing 8 months earlier. In the laboratory, argumentative anthropologists quickly accepted that the bones belonged to an developed male. The key piece of affirmation was a sneaker that was found. Its brand, model, and size matched absolutely the description of the shoes David Howell was aftermost seen wearing. Final acceptance came a few canicule later after a dental examination. A allegory of dental x-rays provided by Howell's dentist with the jawbone found larboard, no doubt. On October 21, 2011, an official annual was made. The animal charcoal begin in the Heron's Nest belonged to David Scott Howell. The question of whether he was animate or dead was closed. But in its abode came a new, even added circuitous and aberrant question. How did his anatomy end up at the top of a 12m timberline in an alien backwoods several miles from breadth he disappeared? The identification of David Scott Howell's remains was an axis point in the investigation. Still, the key advice that finally moved the case from apprehensive afterlife to murder came from the forensic anthropology lab. Upon careful examination of the reconstructed skull fragments, experts apparent several linear fractures. The attributes and breadth of these injuries were inconsistent with those that adventitious drowning, a pulse with an underwater object, or post-mortem damage by animals could accept caused. Analysis revealed that the fractures were inflicted during life, consistent from the appliance of ample focused force. The edges of the fractures indicated that the draft was delivered with a blunt, elongated, and relatively narrow object. This characteristic matched absolutely the actualization and admeasurement of a standard kayak paddle. The cessation of the argumentative medical examination was unequivocal. David Scott Howell did not die as a result of a draft on the water. Blows to the arch dead him. Armed with this accurate evidence, investigators were able to reconstruct a complete and logical account of the contest of February 28, 2011, which differed radically from Christopher McCutcheon's version. According to the new approach of the investigation, while on Catfish Lake, an accretion of the previous conflict amid Howell and McCutcheon occurred. Actuality in an abandoned place, the argument escalated into physical violence. Christopher McCutcheon, applying his paddle as a weapon, addled David Howell at least already in the head, causing him to lose alertness and die quickly. After committing the murder, McCutcheon faced the charge to actuate of the body and awning up the traces of the crime. He dumped Howell's anatomy into the water, presumably in one of the numerous streams or channels abounding into the lake rather than in the basin itself, so that the accepted would backpack it further into the littoral area. He again staged an accident. He overturned Howell's abandoned kayak and pushed it abroad from himself to create the actualization of an accompanying crash. The hours-long adjournment in contacting rescue services was now explained not by disorientation, but by the time it took McCutcheon to burrow the affirmation and fabricate his apocryphal story. One aftermost most peculiar catechism remained. How did the body end up on top of the tree? To answer it, Board enlisted the help of hydrologists and experts on the ecosystems of the Croatian National Forest. After Belief archived meteorological and hydrological abstracts for the bounce of 2011, they apparent a key fact. In March, anon afterwards Howell's disappearance, the arena experienced hefty and abiding rainfall. This led to cogent flooding, causing the water akin in the rivers, streams, and swamps of the civic backwoods to rise several meters aloft normal. The breeze of water was abundant to aces up Howell's anatomy and backpack it through the flooded forest. Aback the flood waters peaked, the body, which was on the surface or in the water, became stuck in the close branches of an old cypress tree. Aback the baptized receded, the remains remained blind 12m aloft the ground, bent on athletic branches. In the afterward months, attributes completed the process. Birds, in particular, a colony of abundant dejected Heron alternate to their accepted nesting abode, and ignoring the animal charcoal began to anatomy a new nest on top of and about them, instinctively aberrant bits of clothing and basic into the anatomy of their home. On November 3, 2011, with a cessation on the account of afterlife and a complete approach of the abomination in hand, the Craven County Sheriff's Office arrested Christopher Davis McCutcheon. He was answerable with second-degree murder. During the trial, which took abode in 2014, the case presented all the evidence it had aggregate to the jury. McCutcheon's antecedent lies and inconsistencies in his testimony, proof of motive, the argumentative medical examination's cessation of baleful blows to the head, and finally, expert testimony answer the incredible chain of accustomed contests that led to the discovery of the body. The Aegis was unable to abnegate the concrete evidence and motive. At the end of the trial, the jury began Christopher Davis McCutcheon guilty of the annihilation of David Scott Howell. The cloister bedeviled him to 25 years in prison. Thus concluded this story in which a barbarous abomination committed by a human actuality was apparent acknowledgement to a chance accompaniment and natural processes. The analgesic hid his victim in the water. Still, the river and the subsequent flood agitated her up to the sky. Breathed birds, after alive it, preserved the affirmation in their nests until the day an ornithologist's gaze discovered what neither rescuers nor divers could find. Music.